Hello. Hope you're doing well. I'm doing a quick recording. Quick, I hope it's quick. I'm going to do my best. This is just a bit of a introduction still on what I'm doing with a topic here of a folk tale that is found in France and that is found in Quebec as well. I'm from Quebec. This is part of my own culture, my own traditions, and so forth, folklore. However, so there's a story, and maybe I can just show you a little bit here. There's a song, actually. It's not a story, it's a song, and it's called La mort du canard blanc. And I quickly put a title there, Canard Blanc, which means the death of the white duck. And I put 2 minutes there. That's a bit of a hopeful thing there. So, this is about this song, which is typically seen as making no sense. It's highly symbolic. Some people will interpret it in a certain way for part of it, but not for all of it. So I like many other people who've come across this song have tried to analyze it, try to understand it, try to find the meaning of it, and it's very difficult because it's symbolic and it appears to make no sense. Before I go into the details of this song, I want to show you a little bit of the approach that I used, and in order to bring out or give an interpretation, which may be wrong, may be right, but it has the benefit of being coherent. Essentially, what I'm saying is that this song is from Wales originally, and it was adapted to French. Now, how did that happen? First, I should say that this song has been analyzed by other people before, although evidence for it is scant. I know that verbally or by direct communication, some people have have wanted to talk about it a little bit, but then usually shy away from making any claims. So that's the situation we're in. So how would this song come from Wales? What's the connection exactly? Well, first of all, the people that have analyzed it, one of the approach used was to link it up with Celtic, or what they imagine or what they think is Celtic culture. So links are being made right and left, and in my mind, haphazardly, in the sense that what's the chronology? How did this happen exactly? How would you make this link with Celtic elements? Since this is a song that comes from France, I guess and this is not stated, this is what I imagine, is that the first idea is to think that this song is a legacy of Gaulish traditions or Gaulish culture. So way back in the time of Gaul, so pre-Roman times, this song would have just been adapted. The problems I have with that are many, because it's such a stretch. So, and I think I'm not the only one. I think that's the reason why a lot of people have shied away from making any connections with Celtic texts, medieval texts that we have, or antiquity references, or archaeological findings. So all of this has been, they've attempted, they've tried, and sometimes they were like many things, partially right, but right enough. Is it enough to form some sort of a coherent whole? Not really, not enough for people to start publishing or for people to discuss it. So anyway, so this is I want to show you a little bit of the approach that I've used. So I'm kind of starting from the end. And I'll be doing more videos about this and getting into the details of the text. But for now, I just wanted to show a little bit of the approach. Let's see if I can get this going here. So I just said it. I just said this. What's going on? Well, my thought process went this way. I linked it up, or I wanted to explore the idea that this song came from the matter of Britain. I wanted to explore that idea. And the matter of Britain gets us to the Middle Ages. So, number one, the Middle Ages is a bit closer to us than Celtic times, the traditional Celtic times, the historical times or prehistorical times, 500 BC, for example. So just in terms of the chronology, it helps us a little bit. It's a more direct route, something to explore. So the matter of Britain. The other thing is, the matter of Britain, there's some confusion in France. Does it come from Brittany, or does it come from Britain? Does it come from Wales, or does it come from other places? Can we make connections with what's going on in Ireland or in Scotland, for example? How does all of this fit? So my first assumption, I'm not going to go through the whole historical, so because it goes right and left, and you're trying to find things that are at the end of the day coherent. So my best guess, if I can find it right here, was that around the time of the First Crusade and the Second Crusade, but more. Actually, it seems to fit the First Crusade in the time period. So I have 3 columns here. This is what's going on in Wales here, and what's going on in France here, and what's going on or in Europe in general, and what's going on in La Rochelle specifically, or not La Rochelle, but a region of France called Poitou. And already we're at the periphery of a lot of historical research or studies, because typically for that time period, when we think about the First Crusade, the focus is usually on the 1%, if you will, the 1% of deciders, the kings and the queens and the people in charge. So London. Much more of what's going on and the perspective of London. But I'm focusing here on Wales and southern Wales, in fact. For the Crusade, we'll see that things are happening there, and I'll come back to it. And the last one for Poitou, again, we come at the periphery, because a lot of the information that we get typically is a Parisian, or it's centered around what's going on in Paris, and more to the north. However, okay, let's start with Poitou. What's going on at that time period in Poitou? Well, first of all, there's a commercial effervescence, if you will. Things are happening then. One key element there is that the main port for exports in Poitou changes around that time. From a place called, did I write it down? I did not write it down. Maybe I wrote it elsewhere. I forget the name. A smaller port to the south. But this is going to change to La Rochelle. And La Rochelle then is going to be the main port then for 1,000 years. So this is significant. This is where wine to Great Britain is going to come from. This is where salt, this is where there's salt, and there's also metals like lead as well. So there's lots of export, but wine is really interesting as an export. Import wool and fabric from Britain. So wool. So this is the time when Wales and many areas in Great Britain are being transformed economically from a more varied agriculture to a very specific sheep wool monoculture, if you will. So that's going on at that time period. So it's very significant. So there's lots of commercial contacts and networks being built up at that time. At the same time, in Poitou, there's something. There's the because we're talking, and what I'm trying to find out is the meaning of a text, which is a folk tale or folk song, and the link has been made between this song and what people call the jongleurs. And the jongleurs, I guess it could be translated as jugglers, but jugglers did not just juggle or have animals and tricks and things like that. So they were street musicians. They were organized, and they had songs, and they had stories, and they had all sorts of things. And I believe that they formed, I don't know if they formed guilds, but they formed corporations or networks, certainly. And so they were organized in that sense. This is the heyday of the jugglers at the time in Poitou. So they are, so they're very active. At the same time in Poitou, the Crusades. So the first Crusade, especially, which is less organized by the leaders, by royalty, if you will. It's more of a popular movement at that time, and all sorts of people are joining into the Crusades. And they're hanging around, and they're waiting to go to Jerusalem, and they're gathering in this place and that place. And so they are a very good public. They're a very good audience for these jugglers. This is very specific to this time period. Another thing, so let's go to the what's going on in Europe, and I guess the Crusades are going on in Europe. There we go. Port de Châtelaillon, that was the old port, and it's transformed to La Rochelle in around 1130. We're talking about the matter of Britain, so the stories of King Arthur, the stories of Gawain, the stories of courtly love, and so forth. There is in Italy, there is a church, and one of the doors is built around that time, around 1120, 1140. And it portrays the damsel in distress and Gawain or Gawain, and it's built around that time period. So we know, everything is debatable. The dates are debatable. So I'm putting together things that I think as a whole seem to make more sense, but individually, everything needs to be checked out. Like, can we be 100% certain that this is the correct time period for the church? 1120 to 1140 seems to be rather consensual. So I'm going with that. And so that's quite early. And that's one of the earliest representation of the matter of Britain in Europe. And okay, so we've got that. We've got the First Crusade, and the port of the Modena, the Archivolt of Modena, is a product of the Crusade. So there's that link there. or seemed because it was paid for by, I think, Frank's going off to Crusades or coming back. I'm not sure which. But it's in that time period. There is a count of Trois, and that's in Poitou again, and he's hiring people from Wales to come with him to the Crusades. So we have, at least in this very limited information that we have for that time period, we do have examples of people from Wales coming in to join the Crusade in the Poitou region. And I think, is it a Baron of Trois? Anyway, he's related. He's associated by ties because he's close, and because he's the expression is what it's when you. So his lord, if you will, his lord is Guillaume IX, William the Ninth, the troubadour. That was his nickname, and he has someone from Wales come to Poitou, to Poitiers, and transmit and put down on paper. Well, no, we don't know that he put down on paper, but to transmit, so most likely orally, the story of Tristan and Isolde. So we've got Tristan and Isolde at that time period, right next to a guy who takes people from Wales and hires them to follow him to the Crusade. These connections are there. If you understand that the Crusades are not just about knights and lords, but majority about common people that are not singled out in documents, but except to say that 60% of the people that are in the Crusades walking to Jerusalem are men, women, and children, and they're coming in to help out in the Crusade, and so that phenomena is very big, but we know so little about it. So it is quite conceivable that you have the odd bard coming in at that time period to transmit stories or songs from Wales to France. But wait, there's a language problem, isn't there? Absolutely, there's a language problem. However, now let's go and see what's going on in Wales at the same time. You have bards, organized bards that form guilds, structured, and they pass on information to each other. You have what is described as a cultural effervescence at that time period. So why is that? We're not necessarily sure. But certainly you have the Cistercian monks coming in from France, who happened to be, by the way, the second biggest sellers of wine at the time in France or in Europe. Maybe France, maybe Europe. I'm not a details guy, but they're really big on wine. And what they're doing at that time period is that they're building abbeys and in Wales, and they're also transcribing in Welsh stories from the culture there. We'll look at that, but certainly there's lots of things happening at the same time culturally in Wales at the time. But also French is spoken in Wales at that time. So for a brief period, relatively brief period, French is spoken, and I'm kind of quoting here, French is spoken in southern Wales, all over southern Wales. So I don't think that means that every single person speaks French, but I mean that most likely you have a lot of people that can translate. You have a corpus, not a corpus, but a pool of this knowledge, translation knowledge, available at the time for this time period, and it's a brief time period. So they're writing texts in Welsh. The Marcher Lords now. The Marcher Lords of course, are a colonial force in Wales, and there's a lot of repression of Wales and Welsh culture and exploitation. At the same time, the Marcher Lords, from 1066 to the First Crusade, that's around 50 years. So they're marrying into the local nobility class, Welsh nobility class. So 50 years later, they're bilingual. 50 years later, they are very familiar with Welsh culture, and they're being assimilated to Welsh culture. In fact, they may be doing assimilation, but they're being assimilated as well. And so that's a strange element, and I'm not saying I have the last word on that, but they're not as stereotypical as you could imagine, basically, as English speaking, for example. No, not necessarily. So there's lots of things, and they have contact with Europe. Of course, they often have land in Wales, but they have land as well through family ties in France. So they have this network as well of people coming in and out. Transportation, and so we have that as well happening at the same time. So there seems to be like a perfect storm of cultural transmission. And what's weird about this, and what's odd, is that normally cultural transmission, it goes in one direction, from the colonial to the colonized, from the strong to the weak, from the winners and the conquerors to the conquered. But in this situation, it seems like there's a bit of a reversal suddenly. Let's look at the overall picture. And here we have, here are the two big circles here. The big circle here represents the Welsh corpus of traditions and of oral traditions, and at this time it's a very large corpus. Here we have, on the other side of the pond, if you will, a corpus of the jugglers and their traditions and their songs and so forth. And so these are two different corpuses, two different collections. The transmission, I think, is going to be done first of all and mainly orally. However, at the same time period, so this is around the First Crusade, in Wales, parts of the very large Welsh corpus is being is being adapted, Christianized. So what we have that's written down from that time period, in my mind, is a subset of a larger oral tradition. I think that's relatively consensual. I don't think anyone. But I think it needs reminding, because we tend to focus so much on what's written, we tend to totally obliterate. And so in my mind here, all I want to say is we're just keeping in mind that there was probably a lot more there at the time in terms of Welsh songs and poems and stories. This adaptation, let's take a moment for this. So the role. So I'm thinking about the Cistercian monks, and they're paying for, and they're organizing this writing down of some of the Welsh oral corpus. Are they Christianizing it, or are the local people in Wales censoring themselves and Christianizing it, adapting, modifying it for the Cistercian monks and for writing it down? That's a question. I don't have an answer for that, but it's a question. Logically, one of the, you kind of wonder what the hell what the hell the Cistercian monks doing in Wales at that time, writing down? I mean, for a conqueror, for a colonial perspective, usually the conqueror imposes its language, its culture. Now it seems they were writing things down from the local culture. What, to me, the only way this makes sense is if they're transforming the narrative, if they're Christianizing it, if they're using this as an opportunity to change and influence the people there at the time. That's the only way that I can see that it would make sense. But the question of what the Cistercian monks are doing there is still open. They're selling wine and they're dealing with wool, so and other things. But I mean, let's just keep it with wine and wool. So wine is coming in, wool is going out. That may be the only reason they're there, just for economics. But I think that might be just too limiting. There may be a colonial aspect to this situation where they are actually influencing and trying to change the people. They're civilizing them, if you will, and even though Christianity was already prevalent in Wales. Gosh, it's an interesting topic. I'm just going to ask the questions. I'm not going to give so many answers, but I think it's a really fascinating thing there. In France, at the time, what's going on? Well, we have the jugglers and their traditions. And also what's going to happen is that the writing down of the matter of Britain, some of it will be done in France or in Europe, and usually with a validation from the clergy. So it's been Christianized there as well. And the same question can be asked: are the jugglers? And we have very little information about what those jugglers were singing about. Are they part? And if anything, between the clergy and the jugglers, if any information that we do have is that the clergy despised the jugglers. they saw them as the lowest of the low in society. So that's maybe indicative that they're taking some of these stories and changing them and modifying them. But that in the oral tradition in France, you may have hints or elements that are non-Christian and that don't have the seal of approval. So that's interesting as well. And since oral tradition tends to, I mean, until the big disruptions of the French Revolutionary War, for example, where French was imposed everywhere in France, before and public education, and that kind of affected the oral tradition in France. In Quebec, public education is really 20th century, 1960s. So I'm linking it up to Quebec now just to say that we had access, and we have access to texts and songs and stories that potentially existed in France, were forgotten in France, were put aside in France, but continued on in Quebec because of a whole different a number of very specific circumstances, lucky circumstances, perhaps. So, what's the connection between Wales and Poitou during the First Crusade? Well, I think that's what happened was that you had some French or also French-speaking bards or experts transcribing in French Welsh stories and Welsh songs and poems. Now, we already know that just looking at the written part, this is true. We know that Tristan and Isolde, for example, most likely came from Wales. The problem that we have, for example, sometimes is that they don't fit. What's being written down in Wales doesn't fit what's being written down in Europe. Well, what would explain that is that you have a larger corpus, and it's from they're choosing from the oral tradition, and in the oral tradition you may have different versions out there, and so if there is an oral tradition, then the easy question, the simple question I can ask is, oh, maybe there's some other out there. There's some other in the French oral tradition. Maybe you could find some Welsh influenced or Welsh songs and stories and poems, perhaps. Maybe not poems, because poems don't translate well, so, right? In the case of Le Canard Blanc, in the case of the death of the white duck, highly symbolic poem, one key element that is interesting about this is the number of alliterations. In French, the alliteration is not used as much in poetry. Other things are used, but alliteration, not as much. And suddenly you find this very symbolic poem, very odd, very strange, and it stands out in the way that it's written. So for this one, this means that you would have a French-speaking Welsh bard coming into France, adapting knowingly and giving a Welsh twist to the form, and then writing down, not writing down, but creating this wonderful song, and this song being picked up enthusiastically by the jugglers who are always looking for new material, and who are transmitting this material at the time of the Crusades, where you have all these people assembling, and you all have this great changing of society during the time of the Crusades, where there's mobility. The people are curious about the rest of the world. So in that context, I think that you get a perfect storm there of a whole bunch of elements that seem to coincide together. I think I'm pretty much done now. Here are some problems now. So let's put a downer on all this. Number one, in the story of Le Canard Blanc that I'll analyze a little bit later, it's very specific in terms, if you analyze it and compare it with the as much as you can with the with the stories that are being written down, because that's all we have from Wales of that time period. When you compare, it's the overall meaning, and it talks about death, right? It's not the death of specifically ducks. Ducks, why? The reason is because it's a familiar animal to France, whereas the stories in Wales have to do with sheep that are familiar, or at that time would have been more familiar in Wales. But the story is about death, but of the human condition, and what does death mean, and what they say about it is completely opposite from the Christian view of things. And the problem I have with that is, oh my gosh, this is very late. I thought that Christianity had been very prevalent until that time. To have this song coming in at that time period, which with elements that appear to be so pre-Christian, is a big surprise. And in these kind of things, we don't really like surprises. So it's a stretch. Really, at that time period, you would have had such a strong pre-Christian. The other question is, are they repeating words that they don't understand? the story of the song of le canard, la mort du canard blanc, in French is very much understood today as having no sense, as not, and it's repeated nonsensically, and people are quite okay with that. So it's quite possible for in the last 500 years this text has been repeated in this way without understanding the meaning. So as we try to understand the meaning today, there's a question. In the Middle Ages, at the time of the Crusades, did they get it? Was that the meaning that they understood? Certainly would explain why it never became part. It was never Christianized. It was never part of it was never written down, basically. So that would explain that. But it's a bit of a shock to imagine that such elements there of representing two worlds: the world of the dead and the world of the living, and that we just go back and forth between the two without any consequence. That this would be understood in Wales, more reasonable. In France, because this would have been. Is this something that they get as well? So that's a question. Okay, yeah. I think I pretty much have said most of. I'm not putting myself into trouble as much as I could, and that's it for me now.